let's talk next about the structure of the incident command system. I've alluded to incident command system and its structure in previous slides, but now we're actually going to take a deeper dive into what is meant by the incident command system. As you will recall from a previous slide, we talked about how the National Incident Management System, or NIMS, is an umbrella that originated in 2003. It's a relatively new umbrella, and that umbrella covers three elements that we talked about, one of which is the incident command system. And as I alluded to earlier, the incident command system is a relatively old element. It originated in the 1970s, the incident command system, under this relatively new NIMS umbrella, with the NIMS umbrella originating in 2003. So let's talk more now about the structure of the incident command system. As alluded to earlier, the incident command system originated approximately 50 years ago. And the challenge that led to the origin of the incident command system was the multifaceted challenge of putting out wildfires in the western U.S. Through best practices, as illustrated on this slide, over time, the incident command system has been refined to what it is today. And we'll talk more about that. It is interdisciplinary. It is organizationally flexible. The incident command system is as applicable and necessary for public health agencies to use as it is for law enforcement and fire service agencies to use. It's appropriate for all types of incidents. As mentioned earlier, the all hazards model is a model that basically reflects the idea that common structures can be used to address a whole array of hazards, whether it's weather disasters, pandemics, and others. The term command is very important here. Command, in this context of the incident command system, literally means being able to direct, order, or control by virtue of explicit statutory, regulatory, or delegated authority at the field level, meaning at the local level where the response is occurring. This may sound military-like, and it is. But the reality is this kind of structure has been found to be useful and actually essential to ensure a coherent, organized response. So every incident, by definition, must have an incident commander. Whether it's a single car accident in which the incident commander is, for example, a police officer who is on the scene, or if it's a larger scale event. By default, the incident commander is the first governmental representative who arrives on the scene, whether or not that person who arrives on the scene is from the quote-unquote right agency. By right agency, for example, let's say we had a radiological event for which the designated response agency is the fire department. Well, let's say someone from a different agency, let's say Public Works was the first to arrive on scene. Well, that person would be the incident commander, but there would need to be a transfer of incident commander to a representative from the more appropriate agency for that type of event. In this case, for example, the fire chief for that local jurisdiction. And another key thing to keep in mind regarding the incident commander is by default, the incident commander is responsible for the entire response by themselves, unless or until those response activities get delegated by the incident commander to various types of personnel whom we'll describe. So delegation, as you can imagine, in a complex event is done relatively rapidly and very coherently and very explicitly. Every incident, as mentioned a moment ago, must have an incident commander by default. And again, the incident commander is the first person to arrive on scene and often will be replaced by the first governmental agency person to arrive on scene, whether it's the right quote-unquote governmental agency or not. And that incident commander, based on the event, will then be replaced as incident commander by someone from an organization that is more aligned with the event at hand. For example, someone from Public Works arriving on the scene, and then the need to transfer incident command, if it were, let's say, a radiological emergency, to the fire chief. So the incident commander oversees a variety of what we call officers, and these are listed left to right. I'm going to skip agency representatives for a moment and explain why that's in there. But the officers that we're going to talk about are the safety officer, the information officer, and the liaison officer. Just a quick note about agency representatives. that is technically not part of that organizational chart. We include it as a mnemonic device because, as you'll see, the members of the command staff, the mnemonic is SAIL, S-A-I-L, which is easier to remember than SIL. So agency representatives are technically not underneath the incident commander. Agency representatives, however, are people who staff that emergency operations center. So you can just sort of kindly a mental note of that. But when we think about the basic structure, it's the incident commander. And then unless and until that incident commander assigns roles, it's just the incident commander. And then the incident commander can assign a safety officer, information officer, and liaison officer. Typically, these officers are pre-identified. In fact, they should be pre-identified because it's too inefficient to decide, okay, who's going to be the safety officer if you don't have time, as happens in a disaster, to make those kinds of decisions. These really should be pre-event decisions based on the type of scenario that is at hand. So far we have a mnemonic of I SAIL. And we're going to talk about some other elements of the incident command staff. By the way, on the previous slide, we talked about the command staff being the safety officer, information officer, and liaison officer. Those are called command staff members, as alluded to on the previous slide. On this slide, we have other types of staff. And notice these are called chiefs. So there's a finance and administrative section chief, a logistics section chief, an operations section chief, and a planning section chief from left to right, respectively. You may recall when we talked earlier about the unified command, I said UFLOP was the mnemonic. That's an event, as we discussed, that applies, for example, to an event such as a hazardous material spill in a local reservoir that affects 2 adjacent counties. But notice the similarities here. Again, ice cream, but different flavor. In this case, instead of UFLOP, it's IFLOP as the mnemonic that works here. So as you can see, there's an incident commander, and then from left to right, the finance and administrative section chief, logistics section chief, operations section chief, and planning section chief. And when you put it all together, it's IFLOP. Let's take a brief moment to talk about the role of elected and appointed officials. In general, elected officials should not be the incident commander. There are a variety of reasons for that, but one of the main ones is we want for the leadership to not have sort of politics intertwined with it. So we want an incident commander who comes from an agency that is aligned with the event, but not an elected official, because it helps to reduce the likelihood of perceived lack of objectivity by the general public. And frankly, the elected official is extremely busy in their own right. So elected and appointed officials, however, should do a variety of things. And those are depicted here. One is to help establish relationships with other jurisdictions and, as appropriate, non-governmental organizations in the private sector. Second is to provide guidance to their jurisdictions, departments, or agencies with clearly stated policies for implementation. And these policies really should be written down. The rule of thumb is, when in doubt, write it down. That's true of response activities, and it's also true of pre-event preparedness activities that we alluded to earlier. And that includes, for example, obviously, laws are written down. Laws and regulations are in the jurisdictions that pertain to emergency management and incident response. So this slide reflects the various duties and roles of elected and appointed officials in the context of NIMS and the incident command system.